I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I just realized that I have been reading Richard Russo for decades. And that's kind of a shocking thought for me. But Somebody's Fool is a new novel in the North Bath series. So remember Nobody's Fool? Remember Paul Newman? Remember all of that? Everybody's Fool. Richard, you took 23 years between Nobody's Fool and Everybody's Fool. And now here we are 7 years later with Somebody's Fool.
Yeah.
Why are we back? I mean, I had a great deal of pleasure reading this book, but you went back to North Bath, and I wasn't expecting that.
Well, there were two things that I wasn't expecting. Actually, I wasn't expecting Everybody's Fool. I mean, I had no intention of writing a sequel to Nobody's Fool, and then suddenly there I was doing it after more than 2 decades, which felt, number one, strange, but also number two, wonderful, because I found that my affection for those characters had not gone away. And having learned that lesson, I think that's why it didn't take me nearly as long with the third book to go back there, because it was just so much fun hanging out with these characters, including the ones that aren't there anymore. In the second book, one of my favorite characters from the first book, Miss Burrell, has died, but she is a ghostly presence throughout that book. And I don't think it's much of a spoiler that in the third book, readers won't be surprised to learn that Sully has passed. In the third book, we learn it, on the first page or something like that. So he is gone now, but he has, I think, at least I hope, the same haunting presence in the third book that Miss Burrell had in the second. And in both cases, it was just so much fun to be back in the company of these characters that I have lived with now for so long.
3 decades. I remember reading Mohawk and the Risk Pool as a baby bookseller.
Mm-hmm.
Long time ago, because another baby bookseller had said, this guy is great. And we were in our when I say we were babies, we were very, very young. And I just remember thinking, this guy, how does he do it? How does he get the funny in there? But also there's, you don't shy away from anything, right? And it might be the New Englander in me, I don't know, but being able to laugh when you're just completely shocked by something that's going on. But, you write about upstate New York, and we can see this trajectory, right? From Mohawk to Risk Pool to Nobody's Fool.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know until I was sitting down doing some homework for this episode that your agent had said you'd started writing the novel that becomes Straight Man, which is very, very funny. It's also the basis of the new series with Bob Odenkirk. But it was your agent who said, hey, wait a minute, let's create a Richard Russo world. Did you know when you sat down to write that you would end up basically building Russo's world, right?
Honestly, I was a little bit afraid of it. One of the reasons that I wanted to write, I actually sent him, as I recall, if memory serves, I sent him about 75 pages of Straight Man and 75 pages of Nobody's Fool.
Okay.
And he said, absolutely, go with Nobody's Fool. Nobody wants to read about the internecine battles of an English department. But what worried me a little bit about that was that I think I was afraid of becoming a, quote, regional writer.
Oh, okay.
It's interesting how that works, because some great writers who write very specifically to a particular region never suffer for that. I mean, Faulkner is at once our most regional writer, and I think most people would agree, one of our most universal writers. On the other hand, I think there are some writers, and some wonderful writers, who get pigeonholed as regional, and people don't recognize how universal they are. And the one that always comes to mind is one of my favorite of those writers gave me my very first blurb, and that was Howard Frank Mosier.
Yeah. Oh, he's so good.
Whose work I adore and continue to adore. But I think he is one of those writers who got pigeonholed as writing about northern Vermont in this area that he called lovingly the kingdom, which is on the border up there. And I don't think he ever got really the respect that he deserved for just how universal the stories he's telling about that remote region were. So I think I was a little bit afraid of that. And I thought that with Straight Man, it would give me permission if I was building a jail for myself. I wanted a key on the inside that I could click and throw the doors open and wander around if I wanted to. And it was only after, and I don't remember where or when exactly, but at some point it became clear to me that was not what was going to happen to me. That it was perfectly okay for me to return to Mohawk, to North Bath, to Empire Falls, any of those places that are, and they're all variations on the same place.
Right.
You know,
right.
I moved them up and down the Northway and over into Maine, and then back out of Maine and up the Northway a little bit farther in upstate New York, and it's all been fine. But there was a time when I was not at all sure, Miwa, that it was going to be fine, and it worked.
Right. No, I understand that. I mean, do we put Russell Banks and William Kennedy into that regional writers who didn't? I feel like William Kennedy had a moment where he was bigger than Albany, but that seems to have shifted a little bit. And same with Russell. And both of them have died. And I think that sometimes changes how people interact with the work.
Right. I'm going to be talking with Bill later on book tour. I'm going to be at the New York State Writers Institute. I'll have to ask him that, although it would kind of be a touchy question, because I think of both of them as universal writers.
I do too. But I think that sometimes it's hard. It's really hard because they're covering some of the same terrain that you are, right? You write about class in a really exciting way that's also very loving and very smart alecky. And I love the smart alecky parts, right? Like your dialogue just pops. And I would hang out in North Bath in a second because everyone has something to say, even when you're like, oh, you just said that out loud. Oh, you just said that out. Oh, you did. Yeah. And I grew up in New England around a lot of folks like this, right? And I love that sort of witty, it's not just cocktail chatter though. Like some people get a little funnier on the second gin and tonic, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. But then you're charting this terrain, right? That isn't just upstate New York. It isn't just mid-coast Maine. It really is like we could take these folks and kind of drop them in to any small town, right? Like this is something, I think Francine Prost said this in the original review she did of Nobody's Fool in '93, right? Where she's talking about how life is lived in public in North Bath. And I was like, oh, that is exactly the way to describe small town life. Like you kind of do know everyone's stuff. And you talk about it in Somebody's Fool, right? Where there are rumors about the Sans Souci and the development of, and everyone's trying to confirm rumors with each other. And it's like, well, did you hear that? And no one really knows what's going on, but everyone thinks they do. Right.
I think that for me, the issue has always been class more than place, because I mean, we've been talking here about charting a kind of geographical terrain and establishing a kind of ownership over land. You know, it's like I have a deed or something to this particular space in upstate New York that to a certain extent I do share and overlap with Russell Banks and with Bill Kennedy. What astonished me when I was a younger writer was that when I went on book tour and people would come up to me and they would say, oh, I know that place. I know it so well. You're writing about my small town. And then I would ask them where they're from. And some would say Mississippi, some would say Oregon, some, they were from all over the United States. And in some cases, not even in the United States, because the same thing would happen when I was traveling, say, in the Midlands in England.
Mm-hmm. I can see that.
And
I can
people,
totally see that.
People would say, God, you're writing about my town. And the only thing that I could come up with to explain that, Miwa, is that if you get the class things right somehow, if you manage to get people's difficulties, whether their difficulties working or their difficulties in marriage, family, whatever the stresses are in their lives, somehow or other that translates as place. It's not place, but that's how it translates. Don't ask me how that works. I only know that it does just from what people have said to me.
Right. And I absolutely. I've been a bookseller for a really long time, and it's always fascinating to me the way people conflate voice and character or place and, well, class. I mean, ultimately, right? Like, that's what the novel is. You are covering time, you're covering character. Like, yeah, it's just funny listening to people talk about their interpretations and what they bring, right? Everyone brings their own experience to whatever it is they're reading. And I have to say, watching Peter Sullivan go from the kid so Donald Sullivan, played by Paul Newman, just to give some people a different reference point. Sully, in the first book, has this kid, Peter, who is exactly the embodiment of everything we've just talked about. He's the one who wants to leave. He's mad at his background. He's mad at his dad. He's mad at and he comes back and he stays. And his dad leaves him a note saying, here are the people you need to look after. And I mean, having met Peter in Nobody's Fool, I'm like, really? But the guy has soul. The guy's part of the community. It's great to see. It's so much fun to see.
He does.
It's great. It is so good.
Yeah.
And you give him a couple of moments, or maybe he just took them. I mean, I do want to talk about you and your characters and the relationship you have with them, especially when you're talking about working over 30 years, right? With these people and this community. And Peter, I'm going to hook on to Peter for a second, not just because he's Sully's kid, but because his arc, right, from the first book to this book is pretty spectacular. We're going to come back to Raymer, of course. But let's start with Peter, because, I mean, he's the one whose career has gone off the rails, his marriage has gone off the rails, and he builds a nice little life for himself in North Bath, New York.
He does, and in some ways, I'd like to tie all of the things that we've been talking about so far too into something else, which is love. I'm just putting that out there now because of all of the characters in the first book. The one that I had the least affection for was Peter.
I believe it. I read that book.
Maybe because he was the most autobiographical character in it, and I think. By the time I got to writing Nobody's Fool, I had begun to understand that my own academic training, and I wouldn't even mention this, Miwa, except in terms of how it explains what I'm about to say about Peter. I always thought of my academic training as something that was going to free me up from this place that I was from, Gloversville, New York. My mother, God love her, her wish for me was to get me out of that town, and I took her view as wisdom for a very long time. And I think between what she had to say about education and what I was experienced when I went all the way off to the University of Arizona back in 1967, I think that I understood education as the key to becoming a new me that would not be recognizable. And when people asked where I was from, I could somehow dodge, both the geographical and the genetic bullets that were whizzing through the air.
Yeah.
And so I did an undergraduate degree in English. I went on to do a master's degree. Then I went on to do a PhD in English. And if that weren't enough, then I went back and did I did an MFA in fiction writing. And I thought that what all of that was going to do was put me in the witness protection program, right? That I could assume a new identity. And it was only about the time that I started writing Nobody's Fool that I'd become pretty disillusioned with the me that I had become, the person that was running away. That kind of plays into the fact that I don't like Peter very much, because Peter too has used his education as a kind of shield, as I was when I finished up all that academic work. I mean, he's just cloaked in irony now.
Yes.
where the rest of these people in this town are not. That's irony. There's no such thing as an ironic defense for Sully or Raymer or any of the people that we've been following in this book. Peter alone has this defensive shield that education has given him. And for a very, very long time, throughout all of these books, I really just did not like him. Because it was like looking in the mirror at that person that I was at the age that he was when he enters Nobody's Fool. Whereas the other people in the story, all of them, I was free to love them.
How can you not love Rub? You have to love Rub. Rub needs love. Rub and Birdie and, even Raymer. I mean, Raymer gets an arc.
Even the animals in the book. Rub the dog who chews his dick. I mean, how can you not love both Rubs?
Just saying.
Yeah.
Just saying. But it is, and Janie, oh man, thank you for giving Janie an out. And yes, I'm being elliptical about this because this is going to air on Pub Date and y'all can find out what I'm talking about. But there is a moment where you're like, oh, we're back here. This for me is part of the pleasure of reading you, though, is I get the laugh out loud. I get the smart Alex. I get the absolute feeling of love that the community has, both from you, but for themselves. And then you don't leave out the ugly stuff. So I don't feel like I'm reading a fairy tale.
Right.
Right. Like I get, and I'm one of those readers who believes that, everything exists sort of in a duality, right? Like it's easier to laugh when there's a little bit of horror because you're like, oh, well, I need a little relief because this is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something, this is what I think of when I think of a novel by you or a short story by you, is that something will always happen that will make me laugh, intentionally or not, because it's you. But you sit with who we are as people.
Yeah.
And sometimes that has to be a little hard. I think you know the character I'm talking about, Conrad.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to use Conrad's first name so that when people encounter him, they can encounter.
Right.
That's not a fun character to write, but he has a purpose and we do need him in the story. And we've met him in real life.
Yeah.
So when did he show up?
Just to go back to something you said, I made it sound like when I was talking about Peter and all of my education and the way that education gave me an ironic shield. It makes me sound like I'm not terribly grateful for, in many respects, the wonderful education that I had all those years at the University of Arizona. And one of the things that I learned there through all of that reading is that if you're going to go to dark places, which I've always wanted to do, then you better go armed with humor. And I learned that reading Dickens and Twain.
Yeah.
In all of these books, I think you go to some places that make your skin crawl. That's part of the life we live. The ugly, the ugliness and the beauty all exist on the same palette.
Right.
Sometimes not on even on opposite sides of the palette. They're on the same palette, and sometimes those colors are very close. They're very close together. What I've always admired about Twain and Dickens and writers who do this sort of thing is exactly that magic about how you can be laughing hysterically at something that is profoundly serious and would be depressing, thoroughly depressing, if in fact you weren't laughing. And it's what life gives us, and you can't segregate those things. You can't have a chapter that's dark and dirty and serious and then go into a lighthearted chapter. That just makes you feel that makes the whole thing feel like you're living with a split personality or something. Mm-hmm. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with the author there if you're toggling that way.
It feels manipulative.
Yeah.
I want to be part of the world. I don't want to be manipulated into feeling certain ways. I want to be with these people. Great Expectations pops up a lot in this, so I'm really glad you mentioned Charles Dickens. It didn't make me wait. And Everybody's Fool opens in the graveyard, that is one of the best openings in recent fiction, the way you do that in Everybody's Fool. But I do want to come back to Dickens for a second, because you do have this moral center, right? In all of your books, there is a moral center. And sometimes it's a little fuzzy and a little gray. Hello, Sully, I'm thinking of you. There were so many moments in this book when you're saying he haunts somebody's fool. He certainly does. we've got characters sort of wondering out loud, what would Sully do? But at the same time, I'm wondering what Sully would do, because I'm seeing his legacy through the other characters. I'm seeing his legacy through Ruth, and I'm seeing it through Rub, and I'm seeing it through Peter. And it's and certainly Birdie. I mean, to know that you still have this sort of moral core with a slightly raised eyebrow too, because it's Sully, right? Like, I mean, we got to give the guy. But again, we come back to luck versus fate, right? I mean, North Bath is being absorbed into Schuyler Springs. North Bath is about to be no more.
Exactly.
And you and I have seen this happen before, right? Like, you live in a certain part of the country, and it's not just New England, but like there's certain bands of the country where, you know, a bigger township just says, hey, you know what, you can't do this anymore. We're gonna take. Yeah. And what happens to the people?
Yeah. And in this book, you learn to a certain extent, not just with the main characters, but you learn when North Bath is no more. There are a lot of people who used to live there who are now going to have to move farther and farther out. They're going to have to. They already couldn't afford to live in Schuyler Springs. Now they can't afford to live in Bath. So now they're going to have to go geographically farther into the hinterlands, into these places that they were once part of the fabric of this place. And now that fabric has been torn. I see that happening all the time. We're talking now. I'm living now in Portland, Maine. My wife and I moved into this place several years ago. We had a 4-story townhouse on the other side of town.
Okay.
And we moved here because it was obvious I'm 73, shortly to be 74. And it became clear that my wife had a fall on the front steps when it was icy. I had a fall going down the stairs with a pot of spaghetti sauce, a broken ankle. And we thought, let's move now while we want to instead of when we have to. So we bought a much smaller place, a condo. It's all on one floor, but it's on top of what's called the Eastern Promenade in Portland. And we look out over a part of Portland that, since we moved here, has just become richer and richer. I play racquetball with a guy who he's just a couple years younger than I am, who tells me that when he was growing up, his parents wouldn't let him cross this main street, Franklin Street, which leads up onto the hill that I now live on, because it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Now you can't afford to live there. And it's becoming even more moneyed. There's a brand new subdivision that's being built kind of at the bottom of the hill that looks out on all the expensive yachts that come in the summer. If you are a teacher, a policeman, a fireman, if you're doing any kind of absolutely essential work in the city of Portland, I can almost guarantee that you cannot go anywhere near the peninsula that you work on every day. You cannot find a place to live there. You are going to be in the outskirts somewhere. So this is another thing that's been important to my fiction, because I've just seen it happen. I continue to see it happen all the time. The most essential people to the fabric of our society are being torn away from that fabric, and that's not a good thing. And I'm sorry I'm getting on a soapbox about it here, because this is America, and this is what's happening here on our watch.
And this is what art is supposed to reflect, right? Our art is supposed to show us who we are and where we're going and the mistakes we're making, right? Like, again, this is part of why I love your work, and especially the North Bath novels, certainly. But I mean, this idea that you can be part of a community and recognize a world that isn't necessarily yours, right? Like, you've talked about this before, and lots of writers have too, that writing a novel is an act of empathy, right? And one of the things I keep, my tiny bookseller soapbox is, reading it's an act of communion. It's an act of community, right? Like, it's an act of connection. It is a physical act. It's not just like sitting in the corner, la, 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 I'm reading a story kind of thing. Like, we need to be speaking to each other. And this is one of the ways we can do it. And that's one of the things I really appreciate when I'm reading your work, is that I'm so deep into it. And there are details that I recognize, and there are details where I'm like, oh, right. Mm-hmm. But I never lose sight of the character's humanity. And so when you're going back to something like North Bath, right, you're not just starting with the idea of this is where we are in the world, right? You chose very selectively who came back in this book. And I sort of feel like you're setting up a fourth book, but I'm going to wait. I feel like you set up, I really feel like you set up a fourth book, and I'm just crossing my fingers and toes that might happen.
But when we're not on camera anymore,
okay,
you're going to have to tell me what you think I'm setting you up for, because I'm not averse to a fourth. I've kind of sworn to people that there would not be a fourth book, but that's only because I can't figure out. If you know where it's going,
I think you did. I really think you did. I'm sorry. I really think you did. And we will do it off camera. But I really think, there's a very sort of clear through line, and it does come back to Sully. It absolutely comes back to Sully. And I think you can do it. And I'm very excited by the idea. But I want to go back to this community, because watching this, like, Rub has 4 jobs. Mm-hmm. Rub has 4 jobs. And once upon a time, right, you could be a mailman and have your family and your house and your vacations and your car and all of this. You didn't have to have the fanciest job in the world. You had a nice job. You were part of your community. Your kids went to school in the community. Your kids learned some cool stuff. Maybe they stayed, maybe they left.
Right. And
a lot of people did leave, unfortunately. And it's like, we're in this position. Have you ever read the writer Sarah Smarsh? Did you ever read Heartland?
No.
So she went back to Kansas, and she grew up on what was considered a small family farm in Kansas. And she left and she came back. Mm-hmm. And she's working on a new book that I'm so excited for, and I'm not supposed to have details about it yet. So I'm just going to sit quietly in the corner and make you wait for it.
No, it's just you and I here.
Yeah. But if you have a chance, Heartland, I think you of all people would really, and it's also
I've very just made short a note about that book.
It's very short, but she's very voicey. But the way she writes about her community in Kansas, her farming community in Kansas, is not dissimilar to the way you write about upstate New York or even Maine. And I have to giggle a little bit, because I know sort of that whole Bath corridor in Maine. And every time I think of North Bath, I'm like, right, it's New York. I do have to stop for just a second and do that. No, we're in New York, right? We're in New York. But can we talk about characters and how you chose to center somebody's fool, and who you chose to center?
Well, I mean, one of the things that decides who is going to come back and who is going to be vital to the story is how much in the last book of that character's arc was resolved, and how much danger they're in.
Okay.
Now, Janie, for instance, who I had so much fun writing her in this book, her relationship to her mother was just thrilling for me in this book, because I thought at the end of the last book that maybe her story didn't have an awful lot of flexibility to it anymore. I mean, her anger at her mother was her fury at Ruth was so overwhelming that I didn't immediately see where it could go. You were saying that each book, it has to be a study in empathy when you're dealing with these characters, and I'm always suspicious when I come across like Janie, who I think of in my mind as, from the end of Everybody's Fool, as kind of fixed, because we're not fixed. We are under stress, and you can only make the same mistake so many times before it dawns on you. Maybe I'm doing something wrong here. Maybe I need to rethink some fundamental things. And so Janie was a character that once that dawned on me, that I could refocus on her and Ruth. And I always loved Ruth. And Ruth was so valuable in this book because she's the one who keeps needling Peter about his own blind spots. And so the characters who are important here in the Peter story and in the Raymer Cherise story get chosen because they have something vital to give in this larger arc. And we haven't talked about Raymer very much.
Oh, we're coming to him because
we're coming.
We are coming to him.
Well, then we get a chance to talk about Jerome too, because here's a character from the first novel, and the second novel, who was important, but in the beginning, at the beginning of this novel, I didn't really think would be important in this novel at all. And then suddenly there he was. And I thought, oh my God, Jerome is in the center of this.
He's excellent.
I thought he was off somewhere. We sent him packing.
You did. You totally did.
In one of the other books, we sent him packing.
And I remember.
And then suddenly there he is offering exactly what Raymer needs and exactly what Charisse needs. Who do you choose? Well, who do you need? who do you need for this story to be as fully peopled as it can possibly be?
But also you write about friendship between men in a way that not a lot of writers choose to or can't, I don't know. But you write about men's friendship in such a vital, loving way, and you give these men language. They have a way of seeing each other and being able to be smart alecky guys, right? Like super guys with each other. All right, someone ends up living upstairs at Peter's house, which is also Sully's house. And I'm going to let you find out who that person is. The whole setup there is great. And certainly Rub is not doing well when we first see him. Rub the human is not doing very well when we first see him. But Peter actually shows up for Rub.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't necessarily see that coming. Peter has a fantastic, there's a moment towards the end where Peter really shows up, and my note, because I destroy galleys, I write all over galleys and whatnot. I dog ear things, I'm terrible at galleys. And my note just says, finally, comma, Peter, exclamation point. And I think he's in a room with two other men and he's really giving them the business. And it's great to see. And you're just like, oh, this is kind of who Peter is meant to be, because he gets to pull on that education and he gets to pull on that sort of, I'm going to use this to be a little bulletproof. It is a little snotty, but it works because also they are bad dudes and they deserve to have someone be snotty at them because no one else is snotty to them.
Yeah. It also gives Peter's mother, Sully's ex-wife, it gets for her to re-enter the novel too, because even those of us who think of ourselves as our mother's daughter or our father's son, it's never that simple. And in this particular moment, what Peter needs in that police station is not help from his mother. He is not help from his father.
No.
It's to channel his mother.
Yes, and he does. He does.
And he seems to recognize that.
Yeah.
And the most fun I've ever had, I think, with this whole idea of male friendships and how unusual they can be, especially since men, I think, are not great talkers about friendship. They're not.
No, you're not.
Men are not great talkers at all. And so, finding a language for them to communicate when so many of them are just taciturn and don't really believe in words to begin with. My previous novel, chances are, that's a story of three friends whose friendship has endured over a period of five decades.
Yep.
And what is that? And all three of them are trying to do what many of the characters in this book are trying to do, is trying to decide, am I my mother's son? Am I my father's son? When I do the wrong thing, who am I upsetting? Am I upsetting my father? Am I upsetting my mother? And those are just incredibly fruitful. I mean, I think of this book as a book about reckoning. This is all about genetics. Mm-hmm. What we have not. If you live long enough, you learn that there's certain things you don't escape, no matter how hard you try. It's about genetic reckoning. It's about the reckonings that come about in marriage.
It's everything. But also Jerome and Raymer's friendship is pretty excellent. It is, and again, it's one of the heartbeats. It's one of the really big heartbeats in Somebody's Fool, is this friendship between good old Raymer, good old Doug Raymer.
Clueless now as he has ever been. but learning and struggling.
And trying. Okay, here's the thing. Raymer actually wants to learn.
He does.
And Jerome is kind of like, you know what? I know I'm a mess. I know I'm a mess, but so are you. And you don't know you're a mess.
Right.
And the friendship that the two of them have is just wonderful because I never would have expected it. Raymer makes it pretty clear that he doesn't think a lot of Jerome, and ultimately Jerome is exactly who he needs in his orbit. It's so good, this friendship.
If somebody asked me what's the big love story in this book,
oh, it's the two of them. It is their friendship, without a doubt. Without a doubt, it is their friendship.
It's to protect Raymer's still very loving, beautiful relationship with Jerome's sister Charisse. But Charisse, in some respects, has to go off stage a little bit in this novel so that this other love story can take place. Because I think without it, that they're not married, but I think that relationship does not survive this book without Jerome.
I agree. I do. Like it. Obviously, it was building throughout Everybody's Fool. I absolutely see where you were going with that. But I mean, when Jerome just showed up, I was like, okay. Yeah. I mean, the man eats his chicken wings with a knife and a fork.
I know.
Only you can get away with that. I'm sorry. And it's such a nice detail. Yeah. It's exactly what Jerome would do. And then obviously with his omelet. And there's a lot also, I'm not making light of Jerome. There's a lot going on there as well. But the idea that he and Raymer can have this loving friendship and ultimately save each other should not be overlooked. It should not. And again, this is what you do, though. It's this balancing act between the laugh out loud and the humor. And it's so hard. Why is it so hard to talk about humor and being funny on the page? Like, it's just hard. Like, you kind of just know it when you see it, and humor is subjective. There's all of this stuff about humor that makes it hard to talk about. And yet you just kind of do it. You're just like, here we go.
I remember being asked at least once, but somebody, an interviewer, maybe when I was on book tour, or just somebody in the audience, I don't know, would say, how do you make things so funny? And my response to that probably sounded glib. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it to. I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I don't think I ever make anything funny. It's the way I see things. I just see Jerome being far too fastidious. His OCD simply will not allow him to pick up a chicken wing.
Yep.
Now, I'm not making that funny. That's just Jerome. If a writer is who he is or who she is on the basis of what they see twice.
Right.
We all see things. What's important to writer A versus writer B is that even if we see the same things, some of us see half of those things twice. And the fact that we see them the second time is who we are. And because we recognize what I'm seeing right now will be valuable to me. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this decade. But I mean, when I wrote Straight Man, and Hank Devereaux is walking around the duck pond.
Yep.
And with the dean of faculty.
The
dean of faculty is trying to explain to him that it's the same thing every year. The legislature won't give him his money. Until they give him his money, he can't hire his adjuncts, which makes them crazy with anxiety. And every year it's the same thing, and yet there's nothing he can do about it. And he says, what am I going to do? Threaten to kill a duck. There's a duck wandering by. And he says, what am I going to do? Threaten to kill a duck a day until they give me my money? It was well over a decade before I used that. Right. Between the time that my friend Kel said that and the time that I used it, I saw that, I heard what he said. And I don't think I consciously stashed it away.
Right.
But something in this bizarre head of mine recognized that as something that would be valuable sometime. And then lo and behold, just a brief decade later, there it was.
I'm also thinking of Raymer and the garage door opener, because apparently someone had told you a garage, like someone driving around with a and I was like, wait a minute. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. I mean, the idea of
someone did did, and it was in the small town where I was living. A cop was going around, was convinced that his wife was having an affair, and went around just to see where what garage door her remote would open. Now I'm not making that funny. That's funny.
It is just funny. It really is just funny. But how much of the writing is rewriting for you? I mean, it seems to me that you spend quite a lot of time, and you've even said this, like your old editor, Gary Fiskachon, you would fight over commas with him at the sentence level and all of this. But it seems to me that even before you were working with Gary, that's just how you were programmed as a writer. That is just a piece of your craft that is very specific to you. So can we talk about that for a second, the rewriting piece?
Absolutely. It is the writing, the rewriting.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason that I understand Jerome's OCD as well as I do is that there's a deep strain of that runs through my family. And I've written about that in Elsewhere and in other things. But I have that strain in me too. And I think it manifested very early before I had much experience working with great editors like Gary. This idea of never being able to leave a sentence alone, turning it around, turning it back around, adding this, taking that out, getting it, I won't say perfect, but is when I realized I can't do anything else with it. My mother's world was made very small by the end of her life, because she had manifested all the signs of obsessive compulsive disorder. She would look at the room that she was sitting in, and it was her room, and something would be off about it, and she had shelves full of knickknacks, and she would go over and move one, just a hair's breadth, and then maybe another hair's breadth, and then go back and sit down, and it wouldn't be right, and she'd get up and she'd have to move it again. It was like there was a shadow on the bookcase or on the flat surface. There was a shadow there that showed in her mind where this thing should rest. This little where should it rest? And until she got it right, she couldn't be happy sitting down in her chair. And that was something that made her life really. You can't live that way forever.
No, it's true.
I found a way to turn that same mechanism in my brain into something that was actually valuable for me, which was to fiddle, just to be content,
right?
Fiddle with sentences until they got better, as close to perfect as I could make them. I mean, I talk to writers all the time who think that that's the business of their editor and their copy editor.
Really?
To make the sentences right is to make them as perfect as they can. They come to that conclusion much too quickly. There is more work that they can do if they're willing to get really cranky about this and keep turning those sentences around, and don't leave it to the copy editor. They've got enough work to do.
This is true. But also, I do feel like, and I'm one of those lifelong reader people, but at the same time too, like you learn over time, right? You do. And I sort of feel like I don't sort of feel like I'm happier when I'm reading a book that I know has been stripped down to the sentence level.
Yeah.
I get more pleasure from the characters. I get more pleasure from the voice. Also, you set everything in Everybody's Fool and Somebody's Fool in 48 hours, which, are you trying to walk that tightrope just because you can? Or is it just, it gives you more to do as a writer and keeps you sort of a little more on your toes, I think? The
vast majority of my books are set. I mean, all of the Fool books, they're all set.
They're all 48 hours, right?
All set over a 48-hour period. That OK Magic is also set over a weekend. I won't go through all of them, but I love to restrict time like that.
Yeah. Okay. Wait, Empire Falls, though, I feel like
Empire Falls is set over a longer period of time
Okay.
than that. But there are flashbacks and all of that, which take you out of that tight framework. But I think the dirty little secret of my setting so many books over just a day or a couple days, a weekend or something like that, the dirty little secret of why I do that, slowing time down that way, is that it forces me to do everything in scene.
Oh, okay.
Very little narration. Because I set everything in scene, that puts a premium on dialogue, first of all, getting people to talk to each other. When you slow time down and you're in scene all the time, that places a great premium on what people say and do, right? As opposed to what they think. And as opposed to the summarizing of time that allows you to say, all right, nothing happened this year, so we'll skip ahead to next year or the next decade or whatever, which puts more of a premium on summarizing place and summarizing what characters are thinking, narrowing the window down, and it puts a premium on the things that I have that I don't do quite as well, which is narration, summarizing time, and spending an enormous amount of time in my characters' heads. I like to learn who they are and what they're thinking about from what they say and the way they say it. By constricting time that way, it forces me into scene, which is the very thing that I love to do.
Which is how we get a Rick Russo novel. It's very cool. I mean, listening to you say all of it, I'm like, oh yeah. Now I can see sort of more of the behind the scenes piece of it a little bit. And I also knew this was going to happen. I knew we were going to hit time. But before I let you go, because we didn't even get to Richard Yates and 11 Kinds of Loneliness, which is a story collection I love. And I know you've done the introduction to the collected story. You know, we might do a whole
one of the reasons that I am a writer, or the writer I am, is Richard Yates. I think I was in graduate school back in the 70s. Everybody was reading the more experimental writers. And it was the Richard Yateses of the world who was living in the kind of world that I wasn't sure I could make serious fiction out of. And it was Richard Yates and 11 Kinds of Loneliness and all of his work really that taught me that I could write about people like he wrote about. And make literature out of it. At that point, I was still, I had a PhD already at that point, and I was still too stupid to realize that could be done. Even more than Raymond Carver. I think Yates taught me that. And in some ways, Carver was writing more about the kinds of people that I write about. But it was Yates who gave me permission to be the writer that I turned out to be.
Which I think is pretty great. But I love the melding, right, of the practical experience and the academic and the way you brought them together and created you on the page, right? Like you on the page is a very kind of specific reading experience, and it's very great. It's really wonderful. I know your work when I see it. And I love being able to say I can recognize right away when I'm reading something by you. And, you don't always get to say that. So it's kind of fun.
Well, no, you don't. And I think that I think you might be the same kind of reader that I am, is that, I find a certain comfort picking up a Dickens novel, because it's not like he's writing the same novel all the time. They're all different, but I know I'm in Dickens' world when I pick up a Dickens novel or a Twain novel. Some of that has to do with voice. Some of it, I don't know what it has to do with, but I like recognizing the world that I'm in. It doesn't worry me that it's going to be the same book over again. I just recognize that I'm in good hands.
Yes. And that's exactly what we get with Somebody's Fool and all of the other books. And I'm still hoping that there's a fourth. Sorry. I'm still hoping that we get a fourth.
Tell me what's in it.
I don't know. That feels like stepping totally out of bounds, but I can see the threads.
You have my email address. Make use of it.
Richard Russo, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Somebody's Fool is out now. And if somehow you haven't, there are 16 other books? Starting with Mohawk?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
And there's an essay collection, and there's a memoir. You could spend a whole summer with Richard Russo, And you could take him to the beach. So anyway, on that note, Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a blast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.